Hello and welcome to the Journey story, the third journey from Play Gwent, and this time it is Alzur, father of witches, and Galanthea, or Snowdrop, as we appear to have the card called. It's going to be interesting, can't wait to dive into the story, and it starts with the road to Maribor. They were all dead, except me of course. Galanthea's tone grew sombre, but everyone else, everyone I'd ever loved up until that moment. The flames of the campfire danced in her big brown eyes as she panned over the gawking faces of her impromptu audience, a company of dwarves, a halfling tailor, a merchant, a soldier, and some colleagues from Oxenfurt. No one looked poised to interrupt her story, and so she continued. We'd been trawling through the countryside, a routine journey on our annual circuit of estates, taverns, brothels, whoever had spare coin to shell out on entertainment. It was a cold, early morning and a layer of mist hung around us, making the woods seem ethereal. A rather beautiful sight, really. On the wagon up front, some of the actors were being rather boisterous. Joel and Elba. Oh, Joel. They were jesting loudly, still drunk from the night before. I remember it clearly because that was when they came. She paused, allowing the suspense a moment to crescendo. The flying terrors. The halfling tailor's eyes widened, captivated. Some of the dwarfs shook their heads and mumbled obscenities under their breath. The others, however, went back to draining their mead and mumbling to each other, uninterested by the talk of monsters. Attacks were a common occurrence, and they'd heard it all before. Suddenly the atmosphere shifted. Birds stopped chirping, the gentle breeze fell deadly still. The mist seemed to grow thicker, more imposing, its wispy tendrils weaving between the trees, spreading around the glade, consuming us. In a matter of moments we were all engulfed by the thick fog, and all I could see was a blanket of white before me. Nothing else. Not another soul. Some of the lads thought it was rather amusing at first. I could hear them laughing. That did not last long. A fearful cry silenced their merriment, followed by a harrowing shriek. Then another. Shadows swooped through the mist above our heads, all around. I quickly jumped off the wagon and scurried underneath to hide. Cowering in the wet mud, I listened to all of my friends die. Nightmarish screams as they were picked off one by one, with nothing I could do. I was just a child, you see? Well, how did you escape? The soldier interjected, impatient and anxious to know the outcome. Shh, you! Let the lass finish, barked a dwarf. She nodded in thanks, and tossed some twigs into the flames. I could no longer hear all of my friends. All that remained was the monstrous cawing from high above as I trembled in my hiding place, crippled with fear. Then, thud! Something landed on the wagon and perched on its edge. A long, scaly tail snaked down in front of me. A guttural rasping right above my head, so very close. I don't believe in any gods, and I never have, but in that moment of despair, I surely prayed. And as if on cue, lightning forked through the fog, and a spectrum of colour whirled around the cart. A piercing shriek as the tail fell into the dirt, severed at the rear. All around, caws gave way to screeches and frenzied yelps. Flapping silhouettes in the mist, exploding into balls of gore as the stench of charred meat flooded my nostrils, choking me. One of the winged demons fell from the sky and landed in the blood-soaked earth, its grotesque body scorched and smouldering, writhing feebly, yowling, trying hopelessly to fly before collapsing back onto the ground, lifeless. Then he appeared from the mist, the man who saved me. Ha! A cloaked figure slumped against a tree just outside the glow of the fire, grunted and spat with contempt. Galanthea eyed the hooded man for a moment, pondering over his boorish gesture, then decided to ignore it and conclude her tale. With all the creatures dispatched, the wrestler stood before me, calm and composed, pure energy cackling around his fingertips. He wiped the monster's blood from his sword and sheathed his blade, then knelt before me, and in a resounding, mellifluous voice, he soothed my dismay. Fear not, little one. You're safe. And there it was, on that cursed day, within the fog, among the bodies of my loved ones, when all hope was lost, my prayers were somehow answered. Oh, but not by any god. Oh no, Galanthea gleamed. By a renowned mage named Alzur. Chapter 2 of The Road to Maribor. Is that why you stopped being a bard then? You quit being Snowdrop? Asked the halfling tailor. Ah, it was a bard name, okay. Ah, goodness no, Galanthea replied. 'Twas the moment I started. Then why finish? At your age, you could have written 100 ballads by now. 1,000 even. Galanthea tilted her head and contemplated. She'd been posed that question many times since she'd hung up her fiddle. Because life changes, dear fellow. Life changes, and oft times it's best to change with it. The halfling contorted his lips, dissatisfied with the obvious evasion, but reluctantly nodded in agreement. Tell us more about this renowned mage of yours, the soldier requested, leaning forward. Bollocks to renowned, snapped one of the men in the back, who, not so long ago, seemed utterly indifferent to Galanthea's story. Infamous, more like. The guy's a rebel and a madman, with a price on his head, not some heroic saviour of little girls. Oi, watch your lip there, lad. The dwarf stepped to her defence again. After all, he saved the lassie, couldn't he be that bad? But why? Interjected the merchant, flapping his arms. Why go out of your way to save a child? I mean, no offence, surely. A sorcerer has far more important endeavours to occupy his time. Was he just passing by and happened upon the ruckus? Figured, nah, why the hell not, and jumped right in? Seems rather far-fetched, if you ask me. No one did, and use your noggin, would you? Spat the dwarf. Mages are all-seeing and can teleport. In a snap, they can be here, there, any bloody where. I like this dwarf. Any Egypt knows that. Yes, you're absolutely right. It would take an idiot to think that. But that's beside the point in any case. The why is far more significant than the how of it, so I must reiterate. Why? Well, because that's what heroes do, innit? Chimed in another onlooker. Galanthea smiled and sipped some of her wine. She always enjoyed a heated debate, and knew full well what a sensitive topic this was. Yeah, they step in and save people. Not likely. Mages are cold. Calculated. What do they care of our troubles? How does saving us serve them? Maybe he was hunting them flying beasties for, like, ingredients or something. Nah, they got them prentices for stuff like that. Perhaps it was just a bit of fun then. Recreation or vainglory. The coarse, scornful voice ripped through the campsite, stopping the discussion dead in its tracks. And fucking pride! The ensemble of travellers turned in unison and gazed at the cloaked man, who still lurked at the edge of the site, slouched against the foot of a withered oak. It was the first thing he'd said since joining the caravan just after Vizima. Most of the party had pegged him either a mute or a dullard. Their eyes now lingered on the hooded man, awaiting a follow-up from his brash outburst. But they were just left wanting, as he remained silent and stoic amid the shadows. I believe, the halfling started, breaking the awkward lull. Sorry, I believe he wanted to prove himself. Alzur, he wanted to be gallant, you know, like a knight. Oh, really now? Galanthea replied curiously. And what brings you to that conclusion? Well, you see, one of my ancestors, would you believe it, worked on the very same estate where Alzur was brought up. He dabbed his sweat-beaded brow with a tattered handkerchief. Sometimes we'd hear tales about the old days. Stories from the past, you know. Growing up, I heard various... Aye, enough scene setting, Galanthea interrupted. Crack on with it. Yes, right, well, yeah, you see, it all began with a child's surprise. No, not that sort of child surprise. Apologies, poor choice of words. I meant more like a bastard surprise. That took a turn, if you will, for when Alzur was but a babe, he was left upon the doorstep of a noble estate on the outskirts of Maribor city, accompanied by a simple note. His mother perished. He's one of yours. The tailor hopped off the felled trunk he'd been perched upon and wandered around the campfire, poorly attempting to imitate a theatrical narrator. It was assumed his mother had been a courtesan from the nearby house of ill repute. However, the various so-called noblemen of the estate were all notorious for their debauchery, leaving no way to determine with certainty his father's identity. Now, none dared risk throwing the potential fruit of their loins to the wolves, and thus it was agreed that they'd take him in. But it was not happily ever after. See, no man dared show him undue affection, for fear it could be seen as an admission of guilt, whilst the ladies of the court pitied the poor boy and ensured he was cared for. But pity is a poor substitute for love. True story. Not to mention, he was shunned and mocked by his siblings for being base-born, and so would tuck himself away in the estate's library. He would read day and night, absorbed by wondrous worlds and brave tales of mighty heroes. One volume in particular captivated his imagination, oft being drawn to read it each week afresh. It was a guide to chivalric virtues by Sir Matteo of Mattina, if I recall. He was utterly and completely captivated by the deeds of noble knights and chivalric virtues which inspired them to valour, and thus he would incessantly wander around the estate and surrounding countryside, seeking trials to prove his virtues, honour, compassion, generosity, that sort of thing, like a proper knight of old, helping wherever he could, hopelessly trying to win folks' approval. However, being just a child, the virtue of valour eluded him. How could he possibly prove his bravery like the courageous knights of the story? Well, one day on the way to market to run some errands, Alzur happened upon a wagon set upon by bandits. Now, any other lad would simply run, call for help maybe. Oh, not him. He needed to prove his valour, so he stepped in and foolishly confronted the brigands. They found Alzur hours later, unconscious, bloody and beaten, lying at the side of the road. He had taken quite the thrashing, from which it took several weeks to recover. But recover he did. To everyone's surprise, the encounter left him even more determined to prove his worth, only this time, he didn't wait for an opportunity to arise. The mad boy went looking for it. And once again, they found him pummeled, tossed in a ditch, and within an inch of his life. But even that was not enough to dissuade the boy, and more trouble followed. More thrashings followed by more recoveries. Again and again, so on and so forth, until one day, something quite unexpected happened. Alzur had once more gone missing, prompting the noblemen to reluctantly commence their search at the behest of their better halves. But once finally discovered, they didn't happen upon a clobbered child. Not this time. Oh no, he was unscathed, standing motionless in a back alley, in shock, staring at the corpses of 3 burly men lying in a heap in front of him, their crisp skin scorched black. It turns out the boy had chaos coursing through his veins. A great power laying dormant within him had finally been ignited and unleashed. He could channel magic, but he could not yet control it. And so the family, fearing for their safety, called upon the services of a powerful mage to guide the boy, to help him harness his potential. And he did. Under guidance, he became a gifted and famous sorcerer, the very one we debate over this night. But I believe that childhood still influences him, drives him to uphold those knightly virtues that captivated him all those years ago, ingrained deep within him, see? And that's why he stepped in to save that day. Why he always does. At least, well, that's what I think anyway. Some of the company of travellers started to mutter and murmur, creating a jumble of opinions, but quickly simmered down when Galanthea began to speak. A curious insight. She paused to think, tapping her fingers against her goblet. I agree. Childhood plays a big part in shaping our lives, but I don't think knightly virtues alone compel Alzur. No, I believe something much more powerful is at work. The most powerful thing in the world, in fact. Aye, and what would that be then? Asked the dwarf. Love.